Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily podcast. I'm your host, and today we've got a special treat for our listeners because today with me in the virtual studio is Richard Hummel from NETSCOUT, who's here to make his hat trick of appearances and also to discuss NETSCOUT's latest threat intelligence report. And in our increasingly interconnected world, the threats we face are evolving and becoming more complex. And as DDoS attacks increase tenfold and attacks become more sophisticated, it's crucial to stay informed and ready for the threats ahead. So Richard is going to share his in-depth knowledge and also shed light onto some of the pressing issues from the report. But enough from me. Buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way stateside, where Richard is waiting to join us once again.
So a massive warm welcome back to the show. For anyone that missed our previous conversations, can you remind the listeners with a little about who you are and what you do?
Absolutely. Thanks, Neil, and thanks for having me here. My name is Richard Hummel, and I come from NETSCOUT, where we are a DDoS and security company. Most of what we focus on here is protecting the world's internet against adversaries that would otherwise shut it down. So my team specifically focuses on the threat intelligence side of this, understanding adversaries, what they're doing, how they're changing, what trends we're seeing, so that we can position our products and our customers to better defend against those.
And I think this is the third time we've spoken in the last 3 years, so it's your hat trick of appearances. I was kind of hoping everything would be nice and peaceful and all those cybersecurity problems would have gone away, but I don't want to start with a bad news story, but I read there's a tenfold increase in DDoS attacks since 2005. So I've got to ask, how has NETSCOUT adapted its approach to cyber threat intelligence and protection? Because there's a lot going on, isn't there?
There's a ton. And, the 2005 metric, we're talking back then maybe a couple hundred, maybe 1,000 DDoS attacks on the year.
Yeah.
Then you fast forward to 2013, and the first quarter, we're talking 292,000 DDoS attacks for one quarter.
Yeah.
Now go to 2022. In the first quarter, there's 2.9 million DDoS attacks, all right? And this year alone, I know we're talking mostly about kind of the second half of 2022, but we're actually getting ready to write our next short report. And so the first half of this year, we're over 8 million. All right, so you can see how this thing is ballooning. It's just growing and growing and growing. And there's a couple of things that we've done here. One is obviously get as many people as possible with protection. Because a lot of these DDoS attacks, they're nothing new. Some people like to say there's nothing new under the sun. There are occasionally things that crop up that nobody has seen before. That's not always true in the DDoS space. Even if an adversary comes up with a new protocol to abuse, most of the time, it's still what we would call reflection amplification. In other words, an adversary is spoofing the victim, and they're soliciting all of these devices to send amplified traffic to them, right? So there's ways to shut that down. It doesn't matter what protocol you're using. It doesn't matter how many new ones you discover. If you implement something like source address validation, for instance, you can't spoof anymore. So there are many, many ways, whether it's from a product-specific point of view or it's just best current practices. And so what NETSCOUT's done is, one, we've made sure that our products cover these things. We make sure that all of the new adversary tactics, methodologies, we reverse engineer those, figure out how they work. We post advisories, we post blogs, we talk about it on podcasts, we talk about it in threat report. And the idea here is that we expose what the adversary is doing to the entire world, because collectively, that's what it's going to take. It's not one person, it's not one company that's going to solve the DDoS problem. It's the world coming together to solve this. And that's where best current practices come in. The implementation at scale of source address validation has done more to shut down volumetric attacks than any other thing that I've ever seen. And so that alone has resulted in an 18% decrease of reflection amplification attacks. And it's consistent across the board. Every single reflection amplification vector has seen a decrease because of this. And so there's a lot to be said there, that it's not just products, it's also security teams and people that have influence getting out there, talking to the rest of the world, here's what we need to do. And so that's really what we've focused on over the past year to 2 years, is really getting into those spaces, getting into those security groups where we can make recommendations. We have lots of subject matter experts I wouldn't consider myself one of those because I'm talking guys that have been doing this for 20 years, right? I've been doing it for 6 years in the DDoS space. Those guys have been in the community. They've been talking to service providers, other peers like them, figuring out what is the best thing that we need to do to make this happen. And so that's really what we've done and focused on over the past couple of years.
And you mentioned that staggering tenfold increase in DDoS attacks. I'm curious, what is the main or primary cause of that increase? Is it the ease in which people can get their hands on bots now and AI, etc.? Is that what it is, or is it something else?
So there's a lot of factors here. I think one is the world is just more connected than ever before. It's interesting. This is kind of a weird aside. I was talking to a colleague of mine about aliens. Okay, I know this doesn't sound like DDoS, but there's points in time in history where sightings of aliens have essentially doubled, if you will, right? We used to hear about it infrequently. Maybe it was word of mouth handed down from person to person. Then all of a sudden you start to hear about more. And then like 30 years goes by and all of a sudden there's like a doubling in sightings. Well, why is that? Is it because that there's more sightings, or is it because the ease of access to that information has become more readily available and spreads around the world faster? And so I was thinking about this in terms of the security space. Is it that there's more, or is it that there's just more accessibility? There's more visibility on this. And so it could be that we've been dealing with tens of millions of DDoS attacks for many, many years, but there wasn't monitoring in place. There wasn't visibility to see these attacks taking place. Maybe there wasn't as many servers or adversaries in this space, right? So this space is growing like never before. And more organizations are realizing that visibility is the key to understanding this space. And so visibility tools are being put in place. Monitoring on various network endpoints, monitoring on various backbones, understanding that there's a lot of stuff happens that unless you have the visibility in place, you don't see it. Well, guess what? Once you put that visibility in place, all of a sudden things balloon. And so there's a little bit of that going on. There's also technology advancements. Think of where IoT has come from. And now we're talking moving from IoT to artificial intelligence and ChatGPT and all these other things, right? The technology advancements have just surged at an incredible rate. That means that adversaries have more infrastructure at the disposal than ever before. And this growth means that a lot of these manufacturers for these devices, it's not in their best interest to put tons of restrictions on them, to put tons of security measures in place, to make it really difficult to manage these devices. No, they want to put something out there that's user-friendly, that's quick to the market, that's cheap for them to build. That means it's going to have security flaws. It means it's going to have some basic levels of things that an adversary can, in fact, get around. And so now you're talking about all of the brute forcing and exploitation that's enslaving thousands, if not millions, of nodes around the world to launch these different attacks. Then you have 5G, right? Now you have wired moving to wireless, and you've got a whole other realm of devices and in network connectivity to worry about. And so all of that combined with that, nobody requires anything anymore to launch a DDoS attack. All you need is a computer, a phone, a tablet, anything that connects to the internet, and you can go into any one of these DDoS for hire services and essentially launch a free attack. Okay, most of them have a free tier of service that you can launch. So you get 9-year-olds launching these attacks. I was talking to another colleague, and they had their kids' friends over from school, and they overheard them talking about DDoS, and this 9-year-old friend turns and says, "Oh, I know about DDoS. Yeah, I went on one of those sites and I launched a DDoS attack." Like 9 years old, okay? So this is the world that we're dealing with here. And so even as much as organizations like ours and other security researchers have gone out there and tried to figure out what is the best way to defend these things, on the other side of this is it's gotten easier than ever before. And so you have these two competing worldviews here that the problem never really goes away. And that's why things are continuing to balloon. That's why we're continuing to have this issue with these attacks just growing and growing and growing.
Wow, 9-year-olds doing DDoS attacks. That's blown my mind. There's a whole argument over here at the moment with the adult entertainment industry, and they want to put in a big blocker where you have to prove your identity and date of birth and stuff. And of course, people like me and you will say straight away, yeah, but what about VPNs? And the counter argument is kids don't know what a VPN is. And I'm like, man, if 9-year-olds are doing DDoS attacks.
I mean, the thing is like these kids have to get into a proxy service. They have to load a Tor browser. They have to use something to get to these DDoS for hire services. Clearly, they know how to do it. You know what's even more interesting, though? The censorship boxes that are deployed around the world, many of those are actually susceptible to abuse to launch DDoS attacks.
Yeah.
In fact, there are more HTTP type censorship boxes out there to launch DDoS attacks than almost every other reflection amplification vector out there.
Yeah.
And so, that creates a whole nother problem. Like, yeah, okay, you're going to put sensors in place, but now you're opening yourself up to this whole other world of abuse.
Yeah.
And so there's always these different conflicting things that you have to think about in the security world.
And since we last spoke, there's also been this shift from simple denial of service attacks to a more dynamic, distributed denial of service attacks. So can you expand on that? And also how you're seeing that impacting an organization's approach to cybersecurity? Because again, it's like a continuously moving target, isn't it?
It really is. And so, whether you say dynamic or adaptive, the story is the same. Adversaries are finding ways around your security. They're finding ways to disrupt. They're finding ways to essentially counter your countermeasures. And so some of the phenomena that we're seeing more carpet bombing attacks where adversaries will test and probe your network to where they figure out, hey, this is what it's going to take to trip mitigation. So what I want to do is I want to send just enough traffic where it's below that threshold. And then I want to send that traffic to 1,000 hosts on your network. So now no one of those that's being monitored is ever going to trip individually. So now you have to have an entirely different alerting mechanism to look at the totality of all of your hosts combined. Not a lot of people are doing that. Now, we have a feature to be able to do that, but there's not very many people using it because there's a lot of expertise and skill involved in getting something like that set up. And it's also, it's a little bit more difficult because when you're talking about profiling your entire network, how do you distinguish what's good from what's bad? Is it just that maybe a bunch of people started streaming at one time and they're hitting a service? Maybe they're downloading a game or a new GUI release just happened and all of a sudden you've got this massive flux of traffic. So there's a lot of nuances there, which is why a lot of people haven't done it because they don't want to overblock. I mean, service providers, what do? Provide internet access. And anytime they stifle that internet access for any reason whatsoever, they're going to get disgruntled customers calling them. And so they want to ensure that they're not impacting that availability. And so they have to be very, very cautious about this. Well, that means that an adversary using carpet bombing can get around some of those security measures, and they can effectuate actual outages or disruptions as a result of that. You also have more and more bots contributing to these things. And the bots themselves launch what we call direct path attacks. There's no spoofing involved. The attacks that come in look like everyday ordinary connections, like connecting to a website, trying to download something. They come in as normal TCP-based connections. And they're also almost never going to trigger high bandwidth or high throughput thresholds. So they're just going to come in there. And unless you have something inline, always on blocking, you're going to miss a lot of that. So service providers, for instance, don't do a whole lot of blocking on the botnet side because it never rises to the occasion to affect multiple of their customers enough that they care about. And it never achieves a certain benchmark in terms of bandwidth. And so the enterprises and the individual consumers have to worry about all of these things coming at them directly. Now, as a consumer, I don't have DDoS protection. Well, okay, I didn't. I now have a new system that I just set up where I could handle some level of DDoS, but it's not going to be a lot. Most consumers, though, aren't going to have enterprise-grade firewalls and routers and systems. Like I've got a whole Ubiquiti set up, but you know what? That's really expensive. The average person's probably not going to have that, which means if 80 to 85% of all DDoS attacks are gamer on gamer, most of those gamers are not going to have DDoS protection, which means all of those attacks are going to them. And then the enterprise, if the enterprise doesn't have protection in place and botnets are permanently targeting them, what are they going to do? And so now they've got to worry about all of this traffic that's not being blocked upstream from the service providers. And even if they had a cloud scrubbing center protecting them from DDoS attacks, they still have to worry about thresholds because they might have hundreds of customers. They can't mitigate everything all the time, always on. And so you have to have some of that attack traffic come through, which is why we always say that a hybrid solution of on-prem with a cloud backup is always the way to go, because adversaries recognize this, they understand it, and they've developed ways to get around it. And so all of this goes into what adversaries are doing, how they're changing their tactics. One recent phenomenon actually that we started seeing is short burst attacks. Adversaries will randomize a bunch of the source addresses, they'll randomize the addresses they're targeting for their victims, and then they will do really, really fast attacks, sometimes less than a minute. Most of the time, less than 5 minutes. Now, when you're talking about monitoring traffic, looking for those RAM periods, there's a lag in there, right? You're not going to instantly detect massive throughput, bandwidth, typically there's a small ramp period, whether it's a few seconds, 30 seconds, what have you. Well, if those attacks are lasting less than a minute, by the time you ramp up and reroute your stuff to mitigation, the attack is basically almost over. But in that 30 seconds that it took to do that, now it's impacting you. And so that's like an adversary understands how our defensive posture works. And they've made changes, they've adapted, they've done these dynamic aspects of DDoS to counter those. And that's what we're dealing with today.
Wow. Yeah, I think for most business leaders, it feels like a giant game of whack-a-mole sometimes. So I'm curious, are there any other new threats or tactics and adversary methodologies that you've observed recently in the cybersecurity landscape, particularly concerning DDoS attacks? Anything else that you're seeing out there?
I think the main thing here is that adversaries aren't doing anything we haven't seen before.
Yeah.
But they're doing it in new ways, or they're going after new segments. A good example of this, DNS query floods, or something we call DNS water torture. It's the act of sending a bunch of non-existent domain requests, subdomain requests to a DNS server. Now, we've been seeing this since 1997. Okay, so we're talking 26 years of seeing this. But adversaries have realized, there's different ways to do those DNS query floods. There's index domain requests, there's just flooding with dictionary attacks, there's any number of ways that they can do this. And so we're seeing a revitalization of that, where adversaries recognize something that's been there for 26 years, maybe didn't get as much attention in the past year, has seen a massive resurgence of this kind of attack. And it is impacting really hard, especially enterprises that have their own DNS servers. It's impacting them quite a bit. And we've had the emergency onboard several individuals that have experienced week-long, month-long DNS query flood attacks. They're persistent, 24/7, always on for over 5 weeks. And it's not just one customer, it's multiple of our customers that are experiencing this. And so the adversary, whether they're getting access to more resources, or they're just getting wise to the fact that, hey, this is hard to do, and if we want to put pressure on somebody, let's just keep it running. And so you have a lot of different kind of things we've known about for a very long time making this kind of surge. More recently, if I had to put a finger on one thing that's changed that maybe was different, is that a lot of groups like Killnet and No Name, DDoS, Anonymous Sudan, these guys started using proxies in a way that we hadn't seen before. We always know adversaries use proxies, but what they're doing is they're actually using some custom tools to scan for open proxies on the internet. Once they find those open proxies, they will actually reflect their attack through them. So they'll basically instruct all of those proxies to send a bunch of traffic to a website. So when Killnet says we're going to go after these 10 websites, typically what they're going to do is they're going to instruct 100,000 proxy nodes to launch traffic at that website to overwhelm it. And so that's something that really kind of took off with Killnet. We'd seen it before, but it wasn't really like a common tactic or a methodology until Killnet really like ran with it. And then as Killnet started to fracture into these other disparate groups, they started to take that with them. And then we've seen some twists to that. Like for instance, Anonymous Sudan, one thing that they will do is they will have a bunch of hosting infrastructure and they'll spin up a bunch of virtual private servers, and then they'll use those to attack and then spin them down. And then for a new attack, they'll spin them back up and then spin them back down. And so it's more ephemeral infrastructure that's really hard to track because it's new IP addresses every time they come online. And so we're seeing more of kind of this evolution there as a result of that proxy usage. And so that's probably the most recent significant change in the DDoS space that we've seen.
And you mentioned 5G a few moments ago, so I'm curious, how is the increase of 5G wireless connectivity, how's that contributing to the surge in DDoS attacks, particularly in the wireless telecommunications industry? I would imagine it's a big thing.
Yeah, it's interesting when we look at this from a trend perspective. It's not that it has contributed so much as attacks have shifted. Because a lot of people that used to have wired to their home are now swapping those out for like 5G wireless access points. And so a lot of the attacks that we see, like I said, 85% are related to gaming in some way, gamers on gamers, gambling associated with gaming. And if they're targeting a lot of gamers in their homes that previously used wired and now are using wireless, that means those attacks are shifting. And so where we see in the wired space, typically we would see wired continue to grow at significant rates as time goes on. That has slowed down, and in its place, the wireless has grown at a bigger rate. So I think in the report, we talked about 79% increase in attacks against wireless. And that is almost certainly a direct result from the 5G shift. And so it's not that maybe there's new infrastructure, right? Because there's more 5G devices, there's more IoT devices on 5G, more network access, which means higher bandwidth throughput attacks. Sure, that's there. But more what we're seeing here is just a shift of individual users' infrastructure, which means the attacks are going to shift with it. And so that's kind of the phenomenon we're seeing in the 5G space right now.
And I'm curious, are there any insights that you can share from what you're seeing into the hybrid application layer and botnet-based direct path DDoS attacks? And also, how do these two differ from traditional DDoS attacks?
So the main way that they differ is that they're not spoofed.
Yeah.
Right. Go back to the days of old, and reflection amplification is all spoofed. So again, best current practice, source address validation, you shut that down. Anybody can implement that. It's not that hard. And so if I own an IP address and I know that IP address lives in my house and it's a shut-in, it never is supposed to leave that house. If all of a sudden it's outside my house, that's a red flag. And I should immediately say, I don't trust this because it's actually inside my house. I can look at it right now. It shouldn't be talking to me from outside. So that's like a no-brainer, right? Just shut it down. With the direct path stuff, you can't do that because like I said, it comes in and it looks like a legitimate connection. And it's the same type of connection you would see coming in for some sort of connection to a website that you might own. And so you don't want to wholesale block all those connections. You can't. It's just, it's an impossibility. So then you have to figure out, well, is there something in that packet that tells us it's bad? Sometimes there's not, but sometimes there's malformed packets. And so you develop countermeasures to detect that malformity. And that's part of having an on-prem solution, especially for enterprises, because that stuff is coming in and most enterprises are going to have a website. They're going to have some sort of external presence. And so if they're not looking for those things, it's going to connect. And if you don't have any protections in place, it's going to create massive amounts of connections and shut you down. And so as far as like the hybrid aspect here is we're seeing adversaries not only use the direct path stuff, but increase its usage. So it's one thing for the reflection amplification to decrease 18%. Now, if adversaries were okay with the status quo, that would have continued to decrease and direct path would have remained flat. That's not what happened. What happened is reflection amplification decreased and direct path increased by 18%, by the way. So you have a 36% deviation between the two of these. That equals about 2 million attacks just in the second half of 2022. Okay, so adversaries recognize that this methodology is working. And so they're using these things to go after the websites, to go after enterprise infrastructure. And then you couple that with Killnet and using the proxy stuff to go after the application layer, layer 7, to take down websites. All of that creates a really big problem. And I know a lot of enterprises struggle with the idea of encryption. And so if you have a lot of these attacks coming in at the encryption and you can't inspect inside the payload, you don't know what's in there. So from our perspective, we don't care necessarily about encryption. We look at it from a reputational standpoint. If we can identify the adversary infrastructure launching these attacks, we don't need to know what's inside the packet. We just say, hey, this IP address is bad. Just stop it. And so you can look at it from that perspective, and then encryption doesn't matter. But that's where adversaries are going. That's what they're targeting. That's what they're going after more. So between carpet bombing, DNS query floods, and application layer attacks, those are the three things that adversaries have really, really honed in on. And almost all of those are going to be some form of hybrid-based attack, where they're using direct path combined with volumetric attacks to try to overwhelm in any way that they can.
Wow, absolutely incredible. And so mouth-watering some of the stats you've dropped today. And for any business leaders that are listening to that conversation, can you expand on the impact of some of what we're talking about today and how these evolving DDoS attacks, the impact they're having on major service providers and enterprises, etc., and how significant of a threat is it for them?
I mean, it really depends on your organization and how you perceive yourself, right? So if you are, let's say you're e-commerce or you're a payment card processor, maybe you are an internet company, maybe you're healthcare that, has web access portals for your doctors or checking prescriptions and stuff. All of these organizations must remain online. Okay, they have to, because if they don't, it's not just one customer that's going to be impacted. It's hundreds, if not thousands or even millions. And when you're talking about all of these like payment card processors, I talked about this probably, I don't know if we talked about it on this podcast, but it would have been about 2.5, 3 years ago in one of our reports. We had two separate instances where we emergency onboarded two payment card processors. Now, these big payment card processors can transact anywhere between 5 to 7,000 transactions per second. And both of these guys had been down for 3 minutes as a result of DDoS attacks. Now think about that. 5,000 per second times 60 times 3. Okay.
Yeah.
That's a lot of transactions. And who knows how much each of those transactions are worth? Is it pennies or is it hundreds? I mean, you're talking like in 3 minutes, you could have tens of millions of revenue loss just for one of these things to go down for 3 minutes. Then you're talking about any e-commerce site. What if it happens during Black Friday? Or happens during any of the other like holiday shopping milestones? And all of a sudden their site's down for 5 minutes or down for an hour. Is it that somebody's going to sit there persistently and keep clicking refresh for 10 minutes until it comes back? Or they're like, you know what, this isn't working, I'm going to go buy it on Amazon, right?
Yeah.
And so how much revenue is lost there? And so DDoS has a very, very real kind of personal application to these enterprises. And if you're an individual user, maybe you have a higher fault tolerance for this. Maybe, you know what, I can't stream YouTube on my computer, so I'm going to just watch it on my phone, right? We have a much better way of dealing with these things when it's a consumer. But in today's work from home scenario, what if you're a CEO and you're on a really important web conferencing call and all of a sudden your home internet goes out for 20 minutes? Well, that's a problem, right? Now, maybe you could turn on your hotspot and you could do it from your phone, but what does that look like to whoever you're talking to? And so every single person on the internet that touches the internet is impacted by DDoS in some way. Now, whether you're the direct target of a DDoS attack or not doesn't really matter. Adversaries, because of like things like carpet bombing, where they don't care about individual hosts anymore, they care about the entire organization. So they're going to saturate the network. In all of that network traffic that's DDoS attacks, guess what? That traverses the internet. And so the nature of distributed denial of service is that it's distributed. And so you're having dozens or hundreds of different countries and territories participating in these attacks at the same time. All of that traffic is bad traffic that serves no purpose other than to take down network segments. So it's traversing those networks that you and I are using. And so when we might experience a little bit of extra buffering on YouTube, is that a problem with YouTube, or is it because there's saturation in the network? Is it a DDoS attack that's causing that? Is it a outage somewhere that's causing that? Like, we don't necessarily know that. And I think we're going to get better about that as visibility increases, like we talked about earlier. But that's the nature. Every single person that connects to the internet has experienced some form of DDoS in one way or the other. And so it's actually very, very imperative that the world knows what DDoS attacks are and understands that every single person needs to be prepared to handle them.
And as a solutions, not problems kind of guy, I've got to ask, how does your Visibility Without Borders and Atlas platform, how does that help in understanding and learning and help mitigate some of these threats we're talking about today?
So we actually had a recent, it was like a sales kickoff that we had at our company. And we had a guest speaker talking about security. A guy that's very, very prominent in this space. Actually, one of the guys that was my very first professor for my master's degree in security. And so he was speaking to us, and he said some statements, things that I had already been tracking, but never really articulated in words. And I think that the same is true for many of us in the security space. And he said this: it used to be that prevention was key. You would say prevent, prevent, prevent. That was like your cornerstone for any kind of security practice, defensive measure out there. But what he said is that doesn't work. You can prevent all day long, but it doesn't matter. The adversary is going to get in. And the more connectivity you have, the more work from home, the more IoT devices, the more different network segments you have, the higher the likelihood of somebody getting in. And let's face it, in today's world, we are more connected than ever before. So you can't tell me that we're going to be 100% protected unless you're off the grid. No connectivity whatsoever. That is the only solution for stopping an adversary from getting in. Well, okay, if we can't prevent them, then what? The key is visibility. Early detection. If you look at the most recent Mandiant report, actually you look at all of the Mandiant reports going back about 3 or 4 years. It used to be that 18 months was the average dwell time for an adversary in an environment. 18 months. That's insane. Like, how much damage can you do inside an environment for 18 months? Well, we've gotten better, but it's still 87 days. 87 days for an adversary to poke around inside your crown jewels, steal data, exfiltrate it, change settings, change security configurations, what have you. Like that's a long time for an adversary to be in there. And so his perspective was the faster you can detect this thing and the better you can have the visibility, the greater your security posture. And what's the one area that provides the most visibility? That is the network. An adversary does not get in but through the network. And so often today, we focus on the individual devices, the hosts. We put tons of IT spyware, as some of our guys call it, on the systems, monitoring what you're doing, looking at configuration changes, security issues. But we fail to realize that the network is the one place that doesn't lie. A packet cannot lie. An adversary gets in there, maybe they can manipulate packets and the sources of where they come from, but it's still a connection, it's still a packet, it's still a trace. And so our visibility without borders focuses on that aspect. It focuses on the network itself, the packet capture, the deep packet inspection. That's where you're going to detect things. And so the better you can get about that visibility, the easier it is to pick out these threats. And then on my team, we use that visibility that's provided from our customers and the network sensors that we have set up to understand what the adversary is doing. That in turn informs our research. It informs the operational stuff we push back into our products. It informs features. It informs the carpet bombing feature that we're working on because the adversary is shifting there. The DNS query stuff on the enterprise side because the adversary is shifting there. All of this is informed by that visibility. And so when we say visibility without borders, this is really the cornerstone of what NETSCOUT's built on. Visibility first, followed by, you name it. If you can have the visibility, you understand the threats, you understand what you're facing, and you know how to defend against them. But if you don't have visibility, you can put all the mitigation you want in place. That's not going to do anything for you because you don't know what you don't know. And so, yeah, visibility is absolutely the single greatest benefit that we have here at NETSCOUT for sure.
And much of what we've talked about today can be found in much more detail on your 5th anniversary DDoS Threat Intelligence Report. But I'm curious, what are the other big takeaways that you'd like to leave everyone listening from the insights in that report, particularly around the new threat landscape and its implications for organizations around the world?
You know, I feel like this is cheesy, and I say this all the time, but it's still kind of near and dear to my heart, and that is just be aware. Use the free resources, whether it's our threat report, it's our blogs, or somebody else's. It doesn't matter. Everybody else has a story to tell. Everyone has a different perspective. It could be you're looking at one of our competitors that focuses on the website security, right? Maybe that's all you care about. You don't necessarily care about anything else because all you have is a hosted website. Well, you know what? Pay attention to that. Understand what's happening there. As enterprises, as service providers, you really need to know what the adversary is doing in order to position yourself. And probably most concerning to me, when I talk to some of these security operators and others, they have a really, really big problem with convincing their executives that they need protection. And so it's a constant battle. Like the operators themselves understand this. Hey, we need to know what's happening here. And now that we know what's happening here, we need to have preparations and mitigations in place to handle these things. But then you try to take that up the chain to your executives and they have to try to figure out, okay, do I really care about that? Or do I want to care about this other thing over here? And whose voice is louder? Is it the network operations security guys or is it the security guys trying to protect against ransomware? Well, you know what? Both of them have a denial of service impact. And so they're both equally important. How do you handle that? And so I would implore if you're an executive, if you're a senior management, if you're leadership within your company, don't turn a blind eye to what your security operations guys are saying, what your network operators are saying, because it's a very real thing. It's a very real threat. And it should have just as much attention as your business continuity plans and your risk assessment plans and all those other things that are pretty much mandatory at this point. You need to pay attention to this aspect. And so that's really kind of what I would say first and foremost is read the report, read other reports, be cognizant of the fact that adversaries are coming for you.
I think it's a very powerful moment to end on. But before I do let you go, we've been talking about a lot of scary, serious, and incredibly important topics today. But I'm going to have a bit of fun with you before you go now. And we have got a Spotify playlist where I ask my guests to leave a song to that playlist, leave a song that means something to them. Guilty pleasures are allowed, but all I'm going to ask is, what would you like to add to that list and why?
So I have a very eclectic sense of music. I'm not a big fan for the very loud stuff, the things that you can't hear the words. And so I've got really kind of two main genres that I like. I like the oldies,
Yeah.
So I have on repeat the Guardians of the Galaxy 1 and 2 soundtrack.
Yeah.
I just love it. That's my jam music when I'm coding. And so I'll just turn that in the background and just let it play. But if I'm feeling more in kind of like the artistic mood and I'm doing innovation or I'm working on something, I'll do a cappella. So groups like Home Free and Voice Play and Pentatonics, because for me, it's the talent of the individual voices, of what people are capable of doing that I find very intriguing. So you get the nostalgia on one side and then you get the talent on the other. And if it's not a cappella, then it's just straight instrumental. I don't typically do the pop. I don't do country. I don't do any of that kind of stuff. It's a cappella, instrumental, or kind of the oldie soundtrack. So it's, a very eclectic sense of music.
Awesome. Well, I must admit, as someone that writes for a living, I always have instrumentals on. So if I've got anything with lyrics, it kind of takes me off somewhere. So I know exactly what you mean there. But if I was to push you to choose one song to add to that list, whether it be a cappella, whether it be something from the Guardians of the Galaxy soundtrack, what would it be?
There's a song that it's a mashup that I just found really, really kind of compelling from Voice Play. It's called Just Sing. And it's a mashup that they bring a bunch of other singers. They bring some kids in, but it's all about kind of inclusivity. Doesn't matter where you're at, your state in life, all of the hot button topics that we could talk about. Doesn't matter. Just sing. And so I can't tell you how many times I've listened to that song on repeat. But it's very, very compelling. I encourage you guys to watch the YouTube video because it adds to it when you see all of the faces come through. You see the diversity of people with matching a face to a voice, and it's really intriguing to me. And so definitely a great song to add.
Oh, awesome. Well, I will add the song, and I'm going to check that video out as soon as we finish today. But before I let you go, for anyone listening wanting to find that report that we've referenced several times today, or contact your team, or just find out more information about NETSCOUT, what's the best starting point for everything?
So there's two links I'll give you. netscout.com/threat report. That's going to get you the threat report and all the collateral. But we just launched, I think it was like 2 days ago, a new Ask ACERT page. And so if you search NETSCOUT and then Ask ACERT, there's actually a page there where we talk about what is ACERT? What is it that my team does? And we're going to have a series of videos that we post from experts on my team. And there's also the option to contact us. If you have a question for us, if you want to understand some nuance here, you can send in a question, and then we'll go through those, prioritize those. And if it bubbles to the top, eventually we'll have a video posted about that question.
Oh, fantastic. Well, I get those links added so people can find that nice and easily. So much we covered today, from how the increase in 5G wireless connectivity is contributing to a surge of DDoS attacks. But that figure you mentioned at the very beginning of our conversation, a 10-fold increase in DDoS attacks since 2005. Mind-blowing. But just a big thank you for coming back on here for your hat trick of appearances and sharing your insights today. Thanks as always.
Thanks, Neil. I definitely appreciate it. Always a pleasure to be here with you.
So today we've been speaking to Richard Hummel from NETSCOUT for the third time, and I think it's clear that our digital landscape, as that continues to evolve, so too does the threat landscape. And for me, today's discussion emphasised the need for greater visibility, innovative defence strategies, and collective action to mitigate the impacts of these rising threats. And yes, a huge thank you to Richard for sharing with us today his invaluable insights and knowledge, and of course, thank you to each and every one of you listening for tuning in. And I always like to finish the podcast by saying it's not about me, it's not about the guest, it's about you too. So anything you've picked up, any insights you want to share, any questions you've got to ask, please email me now. techblogwriter@outlook.com, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, Threads, wherever you hang out. Just look for @NeilC.Hughes. I'm nice and easy to find. But as a closure to this episode, remember, stay vigilant, stay informed, and always be ready to adapt to the changing tides in this digital world. But more than anything, thank you for listening, and until next time, don't be a stranger.